Hello, and welcome to The Black Unconscious,
a mental health podcast about living, coping, and thriving while Black.
I'm Raquel Martin, a PhD candidate in medical and clinical psychology.
And I'm Dr. Justin Hopkins, a licensed clinical psychologist.
This podcast is not meant to be a substitute for a therapeutic relationship with a licensed therapist.
Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, and welcome to The Black Unconscious. I'm Raquel Martin.
And I am Dr. Justin Hopkins.
And today, our episode is entitled, Don't Should All Over Yourself.
Anxiety 101. So Raquel and I had a debate about the episode title. I wanted to call it something different.
He wanted to call it A Case of the What Ifs, which is whack as hell. And
so
I won.
I lost a very heated battle of rock, paper, scissors. So the episode title is Don't Should All Over Yourself. I think there's a lot of meaning to that, but my title was better.
It wasn't. A case of the what ifs is whack. No one wants to hear that crap.
Anyway, we're going to talk about anxiety today.
Yes.
So let's get right into it. What actually is anxiety? And actually, before we answer that question, I just want to say this episode in part comes from a question that we got a few weeks ago. Someone asked about that we just talk a little bit more about anxiety. And so we wanted to do a full episode on that. We always had it in mind to do that. So here we are. So thank you to the listener who wrote that question. And let's get into it. So what is anxiety actually? And we kind of want to acknowledge that anxiety has a lot of different terms. There's also stress. There's what else is there? I think sometimes people just call it like frustration or just having a tough day. But
some people are like, they just worried about stuff.
Just feeling worried.
Yeah. Just
feeling concerned, having racing thoughts. So stress and anxiety, right? They're kind of like, they're basically the same thing, right? Anxiety is more of a clinical term that's used to suggest more of a diagnosable issue, whereas stress is more of a commonplace term. But the reality is that everyone experiences anxiety to a degree in the form of stress. And so one common definition of anxiety is basically when your demands, the things that are pulling energy from you or requiring you to attend to things, put forth effort, your demands actually outweigh your resources to cope, which puts you in a state of worry and concern and anticipation of something negative happening. So when the things that you have on your plate, the things that you need to do, your task list is much longer than the resources that you have to tend to those things, that's often when we tend to feel stress.
Yeah, and there's this whole theory, or this not theory, it's just the way it is. It's called the allostatic load theory. So it basically means your body's trying to remain in homeostasis, right? Like you're trying to stay at like a mid-level. And the allostatic load theory just basically means when you get too high where your body can handle it, that's when like a disorder can come around. So like it's a difference between acute stress and chronic stress. Like an acute stressor is, when you have to go drive to work every day and you got like back-to-back traffic and stuff like that. That's an acute stressor. If it's like once in a blue moon. The chronic aspect happens when you have to do that like 4 or 5 times a day, and then that can negatively affect the way your body reacts to it and all of that good stuff. So it's basically a disorder comes up when your ability to cope with it when the stressor is bigger than your ability to cope with it, when it's like knocking you out of homeostasis and all that stuff.
Right. And actually when your homeostasis becomes this kind of lack of coping resources, right? So the body's trying to maintain homeostasis and trying to keep you at a level where things are manageable. But when you're constantly behind the 8 ball or lacking in resources to tend to those things, your body continues to ramp up the stress, and your ability to establish homeostasis kind of changes, or your homeostasis becomes more of a stress response rather than a more relaxed response. And to that end, there is such thing as good stress and bad stress, so there's stress where your resources may not be completely tapped, or you're not completely overwhelmed to the point where you're worrying all the time, and that stress actually motivates you to do some things where there's just enough tension, there's just enough pressure where you're able to still operate, or you're not too overwhelmed by the things that you have on the plate.
Yeah, it makes me think about when people talk about they're good at they procrastinate, but then like that last day they just like bang out an amazing paper, and it's just because you have the stress of trying to pass it that you just get it out that much quicker. And I think a lot of times the reason why people are such procrastinators is, one, because it's amazing and there's better stuff to do, but it's also because, you know, they've had so many situations where they waited to the last minute and then it turned out perfectly. And then even some people I talk to, they've had the same, like it turned out just as bad, but they'll be like, yeah, I know. But I mean, it was that one time though where it worked out perfectly, so I'm gonna just turn it in later. But you know,
I love that meme about procrastination where it's like, the person perpetually procrastinates because they always pull it out at the end, right?
Yeah.
And that's like the reinforcing thing. So sometimes good stress could be things like deadlines, or just something that kind of like motivates you, adds a little bit of extra pressure. But obviously the bad stress are things that really bog you down and deplete your ability to actually tend to what you need to tend to. Now, here's something really, really important. So stress and anxiety are actually very much related to fear. Stress and anxiety are very much related to fear. And fear is this biological, this physiological, instinctual response to a threat. So when we're talking about anxiety is often the anticipation of something bad happening. There's a fear that something unfortunate is going to happen, and that deep physiological connection that we have to fear lies within our fight or flight response, also known as fight, flight, or freeze. And so for those of you who don't know, most people are familiar with this concept, but fight or flight is basically this, this innate physiological response that we have when we're feeling like our life is threatened. So follow me. So we went from stress to anxiety to fear all the way down to the fight or flight response, and these things are all connected. And the fight or flight is an evolutionary instinctual response that actually keeps us safe. For example, most of us, when we see a spider, let's say you see a black widow spider, you recognize it as poisonous and being a threat to you, you automatically have some sort of heightened anxiety and hypervigilance, and your body literally, without much choice, is either going to fight to try to step on that spider, take flight to flee to make sure that to gain some distance so that you're safe, or you might freeze in your tracks. And this is, again, this protective response is innate in all mammals for us to keep ourselves safe. And the connection I want to make here, though, is that our body actually doesn't do a good job of telling the difference between a fight or flight situation and a stress situation. In other words, the same systems and the same physiological phenomena that happen in your body when you're in a fight or flight or freeze situation are the same physiological phenomena that happen when you are feeling stressed or anxious. When cavemen were confronted with a saber-toothed tiger and there was that fight or flight, that instinctual fight or flight response, the same kind of processes and symptoms and bodily sensations they felt in that moment are the same or very similar and quite the same, rather, difference in degree, kind of response when we are feeling stressed and anxious. And so our body really has this way of kind of igniting these like stressful responses instinctually, not by choice, but this is kind of how we're designed. And it's supposed to be a protective thing, but we also get stressed over things that obviously are not life-threatening, but can feel catastrophic in the moment.
Yeah, and plus your body, like you don't notice when your body's doing it, but most people have like the time where they can really identify like the things that cause you to, not the things, but like what your body does. So like your heart rate can increase or whatever. You can feel it in your stomach. Your pupils will dilate. You can start shaking. You can like have dry mouth and you know, like zooming in on something, like you start getting kind of like a myopic view. Like you get tunnel vision
right.
when it comes to it. And like all of that is to prepare you for whatever outcome you try to have. But the issue comes to when your body has to keep regulating down, right? Because your body doesn't stay at that aspect, right? Like you,
right.
after the stressor walks away, I might act like it's a person. After the stressor goes away,
people stress you out too.
People stress you out too. So after the stressor goes away, you return back to normal, right? You return back to like
right.
the homeostasis and stuff like that. But the issue is when it's a chronic stressor, because the acute stressor is like something that doesn't happen the majority of the time. Like even the traffic thing, like that can also be an acute stressor because you do eventually downregulate. But a chronic stressor could be like living in a rough neighborhood, because no matter what, you have to be on guard. So the issue comes when your body is so used to like up-regulating that it has difficulty down-regulating, right? Like the issue comes when one of the things that happen is you get muscle tension, because if you have to like run away or something like that, you got to get all the energy there. But that can be wreak like havoc on the musculoskeletal symptom or your legs or whatever, because if your body is so used to up-regulating and down-regulating, and with the stressor and stuff like that, it's harder for it to down-regulate, right? Like if you keep going up, it's harder to bring it back down. And the same thing happens with blood pressure. The reason why your heart keeps pumping quicker and stuff like that is because your blood is pumping faster, and that puts pressure on the veins and stuff like that, and that's the blood pressure, right? So if you have to keep up-regulating, if you have a chronic stressor, then it's harder to bring that down. So it's harder to bring your blood pressure down. Like that's one of the bigger issues. There's also research that ulcers are, of course, so like the reason why there's many theories about why ulcers come from stress, but one of the theories is that when you are having like the fight or flight aspect, is that all your energy goes to your limbs so that you can use them, right? Like so
your blood
and stuff
the blood
like that
flows away from the organs into your limbs and your large muscle groups in order to move faster, right? In order to, but what that means is that also when you're stressed and when you're anxious, the same thing happens to a different degree. Our blood moves a little further away from our organs and into our muscles, which slows down our immune system,
our digestion, and that's where the ulcers come from, right? Like so when there's not blood in the area, then necrotic tissue can form, and that's what they said, like where they think that ulcers can come from. There's a bunch of different ways. One of the really good books that I read that talks about like the stress response, that's a real simple book, is Why Don't Zebras Get Ulcers? And it like described every single aspect. Like we worry about like diet and exercise, and that's really important too. But stress is like the silent killer. The amount of parts on your body that it affects, and the way that you can deal with it. Like, oh, you don't want to have high blood pressure because of what you're eating, but you can get high blood pressure just because of stress. Like, yes, and there's other ways to manage that, or digestion issues. Like you may think you may have something like IBS, but that can also be a result of stress. Like there's so much stuff that affects your system.
Absolutely. And actually IBS, so that's irritable bowel syndrome, is very much related to anxiety. And so we're really getting into like the mind-body connection here. And this is not abstract. It's not theoretical. It's quite concrete. We've talked on this show before that there's this system in the body. Raquel, what is the name of it? What is that nervous system that has the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system? Autonomic.
What?
The nervous system that reacts to stress. Isn't it the autonomic nervous system?
I don't like the words.
Okay.
Because you don't need them. You don't need them to...
Okay, fine. Well...
It's a system that tries to keep stuff in balance, and that's what we're doing here. So you got systems that work it.
Right. That's the autonomic nervous system.
Oh my God! You still put it in.
I am. But so then there's two systems within the autonomic nervous system. There's sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is when everything ramps up. That's the stressful one. And then the parasympathetic parachutes everything down. That's the relaxation one. And the only point I really want to make there is that the sympathetic nervous system, which causes our stress response, which again is related to fight or flight, is instinctual. It's not voluntary. Stress comes automatically to us. We don't have to voluntarily choose stress. It's a normal, natural human response. Relaxation is not, though. We actually have to engage our parasympathetic nervous system in order to relax it. That's more of a voluntary response. So there's quite a lot that we have to do actually to engage our body in order to relax. On the point about IBS, I also wanted to say that in terms of the mind-body connection, there's literally a nerve in the base of our brain called the vagus nerve that connects to the base of the stomach. And our stomach has like the most nerve endings of any other organ. And so when you do things like going to public speak and you feel nauseous, or you can't eat right before a presentation, or you have to go to the bathroom before you do something that's anxiety provoking, your stomach is actually responding to thoughts you have about an anticipated issue of maybe like embarrassing yourself, right? So literally,
well, it's not technically the thoughts. It's your body's responding. Your thoughts are activating certain hormones that activate the gastrointestinal system.
Right. So indirectly, right?
Indirectly,
right? Like so, right.
But it's more of a neurotransmitter issue.
Right. So there's that mind body connection, and so often though when an anxiety disorder develops, such as a phobia or social anxiety or generalized anxiety, what's happening is that a normal biological response is being inaccurately associated with something that is more benign, that isn't that problematic. But it becomes associated with it because of the thoughts that you have, and then the hormones that are triggered because of those thoughts, so on and so forth. So, Raquel, I think there's another thing that you wanted to mention about.
Briefly, talking about tend and befriend. So it's more of it's another stress response, but it really talks about the likelihood that, and it's normally associated with females, but they did a bunch of research on it, and it was developed by Dr. Shelley Taylor. But it talks about how like protecting one's offspring, like which will be the tending, and then also seeking out like a social group, which is the befriending part, really helps you to protect yourself too. Because think about, you have an issue, and if we're talking about like old school evolutionary or whatever, and you got animals and you got the men out there fighting or whatever, and then you have women too who also fight and whatever, but you have kids or you have children or you have offspring, so you can't really leave, so you have to tend to them, but you also try to like mob up, like squat up,
befriend.
Yeah, that's what I said. So you try to like squat up. So it's basically like tend to befriend means like you see this predator, and he's circling everybody, but you like, you're not gonna get me and my baby, right? So you see all these other like females around you, and you're like, all right, that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna like squat up, and then they're not gonna want to jump us, right? Because it's easy to jump one person. It's hard to jump like 5 people, and that is tend to befriend.
So in other words,
don't other words me. Tend to befriend means tend to your one of the protective measures to having a predator is tending to your child because you have to, and befriending other people so that you're not getting like jumped. Done.
So I just want to add. Can I add something?
My explanation is amazing.
It is.
Right?
Can I respond to it?
No.
All right. So for I think on a gender level, in terms of women being in certain places where they may not feel vulnerable, or may feel vulnerable rather, whether that's walking to your car late at night or being around strangers who are all men, whatever the case may be, being in a space where you don't feel comfortable or welcome.
Or women, because women be robbing people too.
That's true.
Most of the time, they're the ones that set you up. But continue. If there's a situation,
I'm not touching that.
And you're trying to have like, I don't mean set up like that. Like say, I'm talking about like some intricate level stuff. I've been watching a lot of Netflix TV shows. So say you have someone and it's like, oh, can you help me? With my car. Remember that scene in Bad Boys?
Which scene, Raquel?
When like the guy is driving. It's Martin and Will Smith driving, and they see this chick in this red dress, and they stare at the chick in the red dress, and then as soon as they look at her, 2 dudes try to rob them.
I do actually remember that.
All right, so don't try to play me like this is not a thing.
You are using a scene in the movie to generalize to like all women.
Generalizing is like my favorite flavor of ice cream.
I'm gonna go back to
along with sarcasm and inappropriate comments.
in other words, so
I'm just keep trying to put you off task all day.
I see.
I can do this all day.
In other words, right? So the research basically said specifically with women that there can be a tendency to protect oneself by befriending others, or to protect the others around them by tending to them and drawing closer and reaching in with attachments. And so, in other words, one way of looking at that is via a stress response, in a way of coping with some sort of anticipated fear. So we've kind of outlined like how the mind and body are connected with anxiety, but how would we actually know whether someone is anxious? Well, there's physiological response, there's a psychological response, there's
psychological ties in with cognitive, so I feel like it's
that's
the same
true.
thing.
Like psychological is like cognitive, behavioral,
which is thoughts,
emotional, and also desires and preferences. And so physiologically, Raquel is like literally dancing right now. She's literally distracting.
I'm gonna distract the hell out of you. Like, keep it together. Answer what is it?
So
Come on.
You tell us, what are the physiological sides of anxiety?
So physiological sides to anxiety can be things that we talked about before. So it can be heart racing, shaking, it can be sweaty palms. It can be like sweaty pits. It can be just sweat everywhere. Just wherever you sweat, like you just start sweating and stuff like that. It can also be like, oh my gosh, like, so we said fight, flight, or freeze, but there's also, and I believe it's associated with the polyvagal response, where you just like totally evacuate your bowels, which is what you were talking about. Polyvagal. Oh, the theory that you were talking about with the freeze. Aspect of it that also ties into the polyvagal theory, which was coined by Dr. Stephen Porges. I did research on a lot of stress stuff. So yeah, like it's in my lab.
What is it? Tell us.
No, I don't know the intricacies of it. That's why I just remember it was like when I studied it, I was like, oh, so that's why you can just, some people can fight, flight, freeze, and some people will just like crap their pants.
So freezing is a part of the pants.
I believe it's a part of the polyvagal theory. Don't quote me.
Okay.
It's not like this is, going to be up for the rest of the world to hear. So. And I should know better because it was an aspect of my research. But oh well. So
you mentioned most of the physiological responses. Well, there's
shaking is also one too.
Yeah,
honestly,
shaking.
it's whatever. So there's a bunch of like you can't. It's whatever response you get when you're stressed out, right? Like when you have like a stressor where you feel like something's going to happen. It could be the fact that some people get tunnel vision. It could be the fact that some people act like they can't. Not act like they can't hear things, like your hearing it's just like it could be blood rushing to your ears, and that's why like stuff seems to go low all around you. It could be like seeing stuff in slow mo, whatever, your mental health, all this stuff is a fingerprint. So whatever happens to you when you're stressed out, that's the physiological response body wise.
So there's also like hyperventilating for some people,
especially when you're having a panic attack.
And this is probably both a mixture of psychological and the physical, but for some people, they can get this sense of derealization, especially when you're talking about panic attacks. Panic disorder in particular it pretty much, I think, really, really embodies the confusion between that happens between like an anxious physiological response and something worth being feared. Like with panic disorder, it really has a lot to do with the body's sensations and how those sensations are related to some sort of manifested fear. And so, and then the body's, and then as you fear more, as you anticipate bad things happening more, the physiological responses ramp up, which cause more fear. So anxiety can really, really spiral. For example, if you feel your heart racing, right? Let's say like you're standing up in front of a class and you're doing a presentation and you feel your heart racing and you actually start to notice your heart racing. Noticing your heart racing makes your heart race more, because in that noticing, often people think, well, something's going on, something's wrong. Oh my gosh, I'm feeling it. I'm not going to do as well. Then you think I'm not going to do as well. Your heart starts racing a little bit more because you're anticipating a fear. And that fear and what you're anticipating seems more likely. You're anticipating a negative outcome rather, and that negative outcome seems more likely. And so the physiological response continues again. So this is how anxiety kind of perpetuates itself. So some of the psychological symptoms that we've already started discussing include the thoughts, behaviors, emotions, and feelings. But particularly in terms of thoughts, there's a lot of rumination. There are thoughts of, I talked about anticipating something negative happening. Thoughts about impending doom. You can like really be convinced that something bad is absolutely going to happen.
And it doesn't mean you're wrong. It doesn't though. Like everyone's like, oh, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel. Sometimes the light is a train. Okay. So, don't just think that because you're freaking out, it can be like out of context. It can be, but you could be freaking out because yes, this is bad. Being held at gunpoint. That's a bad thing. Right. So yeah. Sometimes it's a light at the end of the tunnel. Sometimes it's a train. I feel like you just out-morbided me because usually I'm the morbid one. Yeah, you're right. There's plenty of time. I also think that we're gonna get into this a little bit more, but when you're talking about like addressing those thoughts that cause anxiety, it's important to be honest and as truthful as possible. And the truth sometimes is that yes, a negative outcome is possible. And yes, the negative outcome is my fault. There's nothing more difficult than having to admit that this situation that you're in is a situation you put yourself in, which is hard and which why most people don't do it. Yeah. But oftentimes I think that kind of accountability and acceptance of the reality of the situation can help you to address it in ways that are healthier. Yeah, and then not do it again. Right. Like maybe just, don't. Like it's that easy. It's not that easy at all. It's not that easy at all. I understand it like a really goofy mood. Stop it therapy. That was just stop it. Just stop. Stop it. Wasn't that like a Mad TV? It was a Mad TV thing. It's amazing. It's like back in the 90s. Yeah. It's like, stop it. It did not work. It's just like when you're like, oh, I feel bad about this. Oh, don't feel bad. Oh, well, now I'm cured. Yeah. Oh, now I feel amazing. Look at that. I wish I should have tried that before. If only it were that easy. Right. But then I imagine you and I wouldn't have jobs. No. I would be a baker instead. What would you be? What would I be? I don't even know. Oh, think about it now. I'll so pay attention after this. I would be a baker. Yeah. I'm just going to make something up. No, don't make something up. Take the time and think about what would you do if you weren't a psychologist? If I weren't a psychologist, what would I do? I think I'd be a writer or a journalist. All right. That wasn't exciting at all. That was incredibly underwhelming. I think I feel accomplished, actually. I feel like you would be like you would have started like one of these companies that do all those like Black Pride clothing, because you're always like rocking them pins, and then you got like cool sneaks, and then you got like, I feel like you just called me a t-shirt guy. Or you, in the plus you always got them socks. Like you had those socks that were like Biggie and Tupac, I feel like one time. It was Outkast. All right. And then, yeah, that's what I've decided. You would be like HBCU apparel squared. Boom. All right. That was more fun than your answer. All right. You just named my whole hypothetical company. Yeah. Okay. All right. You ready? We do not own the copyrights to HBCU apparel. You love you guys. Please don't sue us. Okay. So the last thing we'll talk about in terms of the psychological symptoms of anxiety are the behaviors. And so this is another thing that I really want to highlight, and that's that one of the things that perpetuates anxiety is avoidance, and this is a catch-22. There's research that showed. So I've had experience working in a couple of veterans hospitals and working with veterans who have experienced combat PTSD, military sexual assault, and an array of different types of traumas. And what the research shows in terms of PTSD, which is, it used to be linked under anxiety. There's a lot of PTSD that's part of fight or flight. It really just ruins the fight or flight response. But now it's housed with our DSM-5. It's housed under trauma-based disorders. But
what the research shows is that what perpetuates PTSD, your trauma response, and also anxiety more than anything else is when we avoid the things that invoke the fear. And that's the catch-22. Like, you don't want to, like, most people don't want to be scared to death by things that they are scared of, so you avoid them, but the avoidance actually is what perpetuates the anxiety. For example, someone who struggles with social anxiety and avoids going out or leaving their house will have a harder time the longer that they avoid. The longer that they avoid other people, the more challenging it will be for them to actually address their social anxiety and to become more social.
Yeah, and that's hard because you're going to avoid it. And I think it's also important in we talked about like stresses and like the disorders, but I feel like there's also a thing with like the whole diagnostic aspect of it, because I think one of the biggest issues is that there can be providers who are not totally culturally competent, and then people are getting diagnosed incorrectly. Like, I think there are so many people within the Black community that they have PTSD, but they don't think it's PTSD at all. So, like, there's a bunch of research specifically with anxiety disorders that Black people, and one of the research studies that they did it in Chicago and Detroit. So, it was lit. The one...
No shade.
Please, I'm from Philly. What the freak? Where you from?
You said Chicago, Detroit. You ain't from them places. So.
I'm not, but like, I mean, let's be real. Crime is crime.
I'm from Queens. All
right, so like, ain't like I'm talking about like, oh, these bad neighborhoods. I'm from North Philly.
Could
first
you please
of all,
not soil the good name of Queens? Please?
Oh, I did not know there was such a thing. I thought that was already like embedded in the dirt. The soil's already there. But anyway. They did the study and it was talking about how the exposure to violence, and it was by Emily Goldman. Sorry about that, girl. But it was, they specifically chose that environment because they were talking about how Black people met the criteria for PTSD. And then they did this huge study. I feel like there was another study that was over like 15,000 people. And it said that while white people primarily met the criteria for anxiety disorders, Black people primarily met the criteria for PTSD. So it's like you don't really see it as an issue, but it is really an issue. And there's also gender differences with anxiety disorders. Females are more likely have a higher prevalence for the rates of anxiety disorders, which makes sense because, things like we have to run the entire world and then make y'all think y'all running it. It takes a lot. It takes a lot to really, deal with that.
I guess I was also thinking of like being a woman living in a patriarchal society, right?
Yeah.
Where there are less spaces that are kind to women, that are like listen to women and are less threatening to women. So there's that. And so that also applies to race, obviously.
Yeah. The reason why we suffer, you have an issue with PTSD not only because of it's kind of like what you said before about the issues with PTSD and anxiety. It's kind of like what you said before about the safe space. Like, there is no safe space, right? Like, so you can say, go home. Somebody got shot in their backyard. You can say, have respectability politics. You got people who have LeBron. What do you get the N-word written on his wall one time? You can say, just do your job, and then you can deal with the consequences. Serena just got told that she couldn't wear an outfit that helped prevent a disorder she has with blood clots, and she still beasted in that tutu and fishnets. Like, you can't, like, you always got to be on edge because you don't really know what's coming up.
No matter what you're doing. Yeah.
No matter what. And it can come, like, within Black environments, it can be like when you walking in a bad neighborhood, you walk home, you don't know who's going to try to jack you. You can be like you dealing with a family that's dealing with their own traumas, and that's detrimental. You don't know where, like, somebody going to knock you upside your head and then knock you upside your head for crying at the fact that you got knocked upside your head. So you always got to be on guard. It can be the fact that you're in like some kind of abusive relationship and then you have difficulty connecting with people, which is a stressor because by nature we are social creatures. Even if you're an introvert, you probably have like one person that you like to hang out with. So it's just it's prevalent in any community, but it's definitely prevalent in the Black community because of the additional stresses that we have to face just by being Black, you know?
Right. And so Right, being black in white spaces, being black in a white society, and the discomfort that comes with that is very much an anxiety / fear / stress response.
It's a chronic stressor. That's the chronic stressor. Being black is a chronic stressor. So you talk about acute versus chronic and how like they have different effects on your body. Right. Chronic is the one you have to watch out for. Right. Being black is the one you got to watch out for.
Right.
Period.
Because being black is stressful.
Being black is stressful, and you know what? It's only stressful because of the way that we get treated. If being, it doesn't have to be stressful, but I don't know. I won't live to the day where being black ain't stressful anymore. So that's why it's so funny. It's so funny. I saw this thing about how white people were going to be the minority. And like 2050 or something like that, and then someone posted, "Oh, why is that a problem? Is being a minority hard? Is that difficult?" Like, and even when because it's going to be more mixed children, but even when that's a thing, it's still not going to be an issue because no matter what, you still hold the power. But yeah, you're thinking about acute versus chronic stress. Chronic stress is the one you have to watch out for. Being black is a chronic stressor because you're dealing with so much stuff that everyone else isn't dealing with.
So just to like connect some of these dots here, right? Like, again, so we talked about like anticipating. So one of the things about anxiety, I'm gonna take a couple of steps back. I'm gonna connect a couple of dots. We talked about the psychological signs of anxiety and the thoughts that people can have, the racing thoughts, the rumination. One category of thoughts I would categorize under the like what ifs. And so because anxiety is about anticipating something negative happening, so you may always have the question, what if? In fact, one of the hallmarks of generalized anxiety disorder is someone who is constantly wondering what could happen. What if this thing happens that is negative? So, or
what I should have done.
So that's the other one.
So that's why you shouldn't should all over yourself. Talking about the what ifs. That title sucked. My title was amazing.
I was about to give us both credit, but I'm just give myself credit.
What? No, I'm taking credit. Don't should all over yourself.
So they're saying like what ifs, but
you
then
used
there's
to be so nice, man.
I know you made me mean. I don't know. And then there's also like the shoulds, right? So people feeling like there's something they should be doing that they're not doing, that there are things that they ought to be thinking about or accomplishing that they aren't accomplishing or thinking about, feeling like there's something you need to be bettering or improving. Like that produces a kind of pressure or self-doubt or self-criticism. And so shitting all over yourself produces anxiety.
Yeah. And there's different factors that contribute to the anxiety and the stress, right? Like, so to me, one of the factors is like your level that different facets of the stress. So like one is if you have an outlet for the stress, right? If you don't have an outlet for the stress that you're experiencing, you're more likely probably to have a certain disorder. There's also social support, and that can be like your family of origin, which is the family you're born into, or like your family of choice, which I think friends become family. So if you don't have that kind of aspect, that's another one. There's like perceived control over the whole thing. Like if you feel like you're getting this stuff and you don't have any control over it, that's stressful, right? And then not only that someone's taking away your autonomy, it's one of the reasons why I feel like there's such a big thing within the Black community with men and women about like how you can lose your life for disrespecting somebody, because it was taken from us for so long that disrespecting someone can really cost you. Like that's a problem. That's a stressful thing. There's also like the predictability of it. Like if you knew every single day at 5 p.m. you were going to get like a little electric shock, it probably wouldn't be as stressful. But if you know that you're getting like 5 shocks and you don't know what time of the day it is, that creates a disorder, right? And like they do a bunch of research over that. Right. And then like just the way you think things are going to go, like the hopelessness aspect, the being hopeless, or feeling like you can't do anything about it, that's anxiety provoking, which can lead to other people in depression or to anxiety, right? Like if you don't know what's going to get better, you feel like it's not going to get any better, which Black community, if you feel like we're protesting and change the policy and you feel like nothing's changing, that can also have some kind of disorder. And that's why it can be difficult for Black people. Like there's so many different facets of it that make it become a disorder with anxiety.
Absolutely. And I think, Raquel, you said earlier about, this was another dot I wanted to connect. You said earlier about how stress leads to other issues. That model that you talked about with chronic stress and the body's fight to maintain homeostasis.
Oh, the allostatic load.
Yes, the allostatic load. And when when your body's ability to establish homeostasis is overwhelmed, a lot of things happen that lead to physical disorder. And so one of those things is like we talked about, like Raquel is distracting me again. You won.
I won. That's all. And now we can get back to work.
Okay. So we talked about some of the physiological responses to stress. And if you think about it, right, like the blood moving away from your organs into your limbs, your heart rate ramping up, right? This happens in fight, flight, or freeze. It also happens when you're stressed or anxious. And then you think about the rates of hypertension in the Black community, right? Part of it goes to food choice and cultural preference when it comes to diet. And another contributing aspect, though, is stress. Stress has a physiological consequence.
And trauma. And what you perceive as trauma, because a lot of individuals don't think certain things are trauma. And a lot of things are... excuse me, I don't know what. A lot of things are traumatic, you know? So it's any kind of deeply distressing or disturbing experience that makes it so that you cannot cope with it.
Right.
Like, so you watching all these videos of people getting shot, traumatic, especially if, period. Like, they look like you, that's scary. Having to walk through a bad neighborhood, that's trauma. And you may not think it's trauma, right? Because everybody around you got it. That means everybody around you got trauma, like PTSD. Yeah. That's just like Charlemagne the God was talking about. His first book was like the Black Privilege one. His next one is
Shook Ones.
Oh, thanks, Shook Ones. And he's talking about his anxiety disorder. And he went to the doctor and didn't even know he was having panic attacks. Dude was having panic and anxiety attacks, didn't even know it. And it wasn't until he went to a doctor about it. So it's just like, just because everybody around you has the same symptoms doesn't mean that everybody around you isn't suffering as much as you are.
Mm-hmm. And his book is actually Shook One. I was thinking about the Mobb Deep song Shook Ones. No, but it's Shook One, Anxiety Playing Tricks on Me, right? Yeah. And I do think, again, anxiety is so prevalent in our communities that sometimes, because of the things that we go through, being people of color, and often the trauma that we're exposed to because of the circumstances that we're in, the people that we interact with have the same thing, and so it's thought of as normal, but it's not. And what we hope we're making clear is that your body has it's a physiological response connected to also your psychology. But because it's physiological, it's instinctual. Like, it's not your blood pressure doesn't increase like on command. Right? So if you're a human, these are the functions of the human body. So even though there might be other people in your neighborhood that are experiencing the same thing, or in communities that are experiencing the same thing, and you think it's rather benign, it's not. It's just that everyone may be having the same kind of anxious response.
Yeah, and especially since there's been research on like epigenetics with Black people, which basically means the genetic and like molecular level of things being passed down. So basically, the trauma that we've all been experiencing, and that our parents and then our grandparents and our great-great-grandparents has basically been passed down. And the chronic levels of stress as a result of living in a society where we are exposed to systemic racism and all that other stuff has affected not only like how we pass down things within our family, like, I don't know, tall tales or like, you know, jokes and stuff like that. We're also passing down our trauma. So it's an issue.
Yeah, it's problematic. And yet I think sometimes the intent, right? The stories that we share, I think there's also a desire to process them, and also for self-preservation, for protection.
Yeah, it's like, don't walk down that street. He got shot. Oh, well, I'm not going to walk down that street.
Or even on another level, right? We never know, Raquel, like when you were saying like this, if you knew you were going to get a shock every day at 5 o'clock, that's different. But when you can't anticipate when you're going to be shocked, in other words, when you can't anticipate when you're going to be dehumanized, when you can't anticipate when you're going to experience the microaggression, then you feel anxious. And when you find yourself in all white spaces, there's a higher chance that you're going to be dehumanized because you are the other.
Yeah, and especially when it's all white spaces of people you're not familiar with, right? So like I feel like every time we talk about like the white spaces and stuff like that, I don't want anyone to think it's just like, oh, as soon as we walk into a room of friends and we've known them for years and they're still white, we're like, I still can't trust you. That's not the case. Like, the case is when you're meeting new people and you're not sure, or you're in an area where it's primarily, I don't know, they're known for acting crazy, like, I don't know, policy, or anytime we're doing long road trips and we got to stop for gas. Dude, overalls and pickup trucks scare the crap out of me.
Yeah, and I think people don't realize like why things like the Confederate flag, right, and Confederate statues, like just think of what we're saying about what anxiety is. There is a stimuli, whether that stimuli be a thought where you're anticipating something negative happening, or an object that represents or symbolizes pain is in your environment. We have natural reactions to that. So these things like Confederate flags, Confederate statues, MAGA hats, any Trump paraphernalia.
I don't like when I can't see like pavement. I don't like when I'm around like big fields. Like, Halloween's coming up and they do those like, haunted woods. No. Because they're like, oh, she went to a haunted woods and she went missing. That's just like a thing in me that I'm just like, no, I read too much stuff.
Right.
Because the stuff still happens, right?
Right. Or at least we know it represents, for us, it ties to things in our like history as Black people, either somewhere in our experience, collective experience as a community.
Yeah.
And so these things trigger an anxious response in a lot of us, and it changes how we think, it changes how we feel, it changes how we approach future situations. And there are things that we do to kind of try to manage that fear and our racial pain. And unfortunately, I think there are pros and cons to that.
Yeah, and it's I mean, there's going to be pros and cons to everything, but I think one of the biggest things is trying to identify ways to like manage it. Like, how do you figure out ways to make it not be as bad, basically?
The racial anxiety, you mean?
The way you deal with it. Because there's only so much I can do about if I'm dealing with people who are racist, right? Because I'm not going to walk around educating everyone. I just have no interest in that, and it's exhausting. And I used to be like that, and it didn't really help me.
And not everyone wants to be educated, is willing to learn, or cares enough to hear what you have to say. And that's just life.
And that's just the way it is. And, you just have to move on from that. I think that the aspect is like, how do you manage the stress? How do you manage the anxiety? And anxiety is not just the typical, it's not just like, oh, well, I'm getting anxious, and anxiety is like a real disorder. Like, I have a really good friend who has it, and it affects every single thing. It affects any disorder affects your thoughts, so it affects your cognitions, your behaviors, and your feelings. When you have so much anxiety that you can't leave the house, when you have so much anxiety that like you can't even be around people because it's staggering. It's not like it's just, oh, I feel anxious and I power through it. Some people can. I feel anxious and I feel so awful that I cannot focus. I feel like I'm going to pass out. I'm having panic attacks. Anxiety is like a real disorder, and a lot of people are suffering from it, and you think it's just you have to power through it. I mean, you can, but it's rough. It's not just the typical like I'm just feeling stressed out. It's when it gets out of control, and some people can't.
Right. It's so severe that they can't.
So I think it's always under just to be mindful of stuff. The fact that these disorders do in fact exist. Yeah. And everyone's is different. Yeah,
right. That's always important to note, that the symptoms can look different depending on who you are. I want to kind of also say that when it comes to these anticipatory thoughts of like a what if, or like a what or a should, when you're saying this, those are very key. Like should, when you're having thoughts that have the word should in it, or what if, that's a sign that you should really pay attention, as I say should, that you should really pay attention to what you're thinking and just consider whether those thoughts are helpful or not.
Yeah, because there's a bunch of thinking traps, right?
Right.
So what would you say are some of the biggest thinking traps?
I would say
we call them maladaptive cognitions in the biz,
but in the biz,
but like thinking traps. What are they?
Well, one of them I think for sure is catastrophizing. That is a big one.
Yeah,
where we assume that the outcome is going to be negative for sure, and not just negative, but the worst possible outcome is going to happen. For example, if you're about to take a test and you're experiencing some test anxiety, also known as I anticipate I'm a fail, then you imagine yourself flunking out of class and maybe having to leave school and then not sure of what career you're going to pursue. That is called catastrophizing.
Yeah, like just failing one test means that you're going to be homeless. Like what? That it's basically that escalated quickly.
Yeah,
we all know that statement.
And that sounds like really, really extreme. But thoughts can tend to spiral. You can start to think, oh my goodness, I don't know if I studied all that well. Oh, my grades are going to suffer. Like if they suffer, I don't know if I'm going to be competitive enough for the job that I would like to get. If I'm not competitive enough for the job that I would like to get, then I'm not going to be able to make as much money. If I don't make enough money, I'm not going to be able to pay my school loans back. If I'm not going to be able to put my school loans back, then I'm going to be in financial turmoil. And it can go on and on and on and on and again. And so catastrophizing is one of those things that really builds on itself and can really send you into a dump. What about for you, Raquel? What's a thinking trap that you think is really common?
Black or white thinking. If we're going alongside if we're going alongside the whole test thing, it's like, oh, if I don't do well on this test, I'm a failure. Well, hold on, wait a minute. Like there's just
it's either or. Yeah.
There is no, either or when it comes to that, or mind reading.
Yeah.
Mind reading is the big one, and I do this one all the time. Like I'm gonna say that, and she gonna say that, and then I'm gonna say that, and she gonna say no, so I'm not even gonna ask. Oh, okay. Or we could actually ask them, and then if that makes you uncomfortable, prepare for the scenario if the person says no or the person acts a certain way. But I feel like mind reading is definitely one of the big ones.
I think when it comes to like specific phobias about things, like there are some people that are scared of flying. Often there's and this happens a lot with trauma. If you've experienced something traumatic, most on a large scale, trauma is not very probable. But if you've experienced one, you can feel like it is probable. And so this thinking trap is called mistaking a low probability event for a high probability event. For example, it is just a very low probability that a plane will crash. But if you have a fear of flying, to you, that probability seems a lot larger. It's actually more,
Don't say it's more likely to get into a car crash. I get that, but the older I get, the more I get afraid of flying.
Really?
I didn't used to. I used to fly from Nashville to Philly once a month, like the first 2 years of undergrad, get them Southwest Bing deals.
But that is the go-to statistic that's cited, that you're more likely to get into a car crash than you are into a plane crash.
And yet, still scared out of my mind.
Yeah.
So how would you say you manage it?
I think, well, one thing I want to say is just that, it's really helpful to go to therapy to talk through these things. But we've talked about this before. You have to be mindful of your thoughts. Be mindful of the words that you are telling yourself. Think about your thinking, which is called metacognition. Be mindful of the words that come to your mind and how you speak to yourself, because you're engaging in self-talk, and your self-talk is so powerful that it literally does enact certain chemicals within your body, oxytocin, cortisol, other hormones that ignite a physiological response, whether that's knots in your stomach, heart racing, sweaty palms. All of those things matter. So be mindful of the thoughts that you have. Challenge your thoughts when you know that you're thinking something negative. Ask yourself, well, what is the evidence that this will absolutely happen?
How realistic is this?
Would my evidence hold up in a court of law? Let me outline the evidence for and the evidence against. Let me compare. And if I have some evidence for, then you can keep those parts. But if you have evidence against, any evidence against at all, then you have to rewrite the thought to be more fair. And it's not about just thinking positive. Like, I don't like when people try to make it that simple. It's not about just thinking positive. It's about thinking truthfully and thinking in ways that are helpful to you. So it might not be the case where you're just saying, oh, I'm definitely going to get 100 on this test, even though I didn't study. It could be just thinking there's a possibility that I may not do as well on this test as I would like, but I can still have the opportunity to do better. So it's about just thinking in ways that are accurate and truthful.
I was going to say there's also like just doing breathing exercises. A lot of people joke about this whole breathing exercise thing, but one, you can breathe everywhere. You should be, just an FYI. Try to breathe at least once a day. There's all these like technicalities on it. I don't like being technical. Basically, breathing in deep and slowly just tells your body to chill out, tells your brain to chill out, which calms you down, right? Everything happens, the stress response happens as a result of like neurotransmitters, and which is basically brain chemicals being released and telling your body to like, come on, like let's get this moving because we about to have to like squat up. But if you breathe slowly, it sends a message to your brain like, oh no, it's cool, they walked away, we ain't gotta fight. So you calm down. Like no matter what, like no matter where you're at, whether you're about to present for something, just try to like take a minute and breathe. And also try to make sure, like try to see, the aspects that I talked about with stress, like the outlet for frustration, the social support, the predictability, the control, the perception of things worsening. See if you can work on any of those. See if there's any way, if you can do more social support, if you can try to make like get more control over it, try to work on that.
Right. I think we jammed a lot into this episode. There's a lot of information here, despite Raquel's distractions. And
I'm so freaking amazing, and even when I'm bad, I'm good. Like, you don't understand. I'm over here like, yes, neurotransmitter, bam, doing a wop, boom. But on that note,
we're gonna wrap it up, you guys. We hope you enjoyed this episode and you learned about anxiety, where it comes from, its connection to fear, and your physiological responses. We also hope that you understand that you can actually manipulate your physiological responses by paying attention to your thoughts and adjusting them where you need. So thank you for tuning in.
Thank you. And we also want to thank you for tuning in every single week, because last month we had 1,200 downloads and this month we have 1,700 downloads. So please, thank you. And also leave us reviews. That's amazing, on iTunes. And also send us questions at theblackunconscious.com. Have a good night or day. Yeah, that
See you
too.
next week.
Bye.